Before we familiarize ourselves with the musician, composer, translator and patron Bernhard Henric Crusell, we first need to know a little about the background for what was a usual cultural life in the 18th-19th century breakpoint. The Stockholm music scene was nevertheless relatively big in music performance, but not fully developed in the late 1700s. It is true that thriving cultural life under Gustav III, despite this cultural protégé, had not reached a fundamental structure. The current political climate also played a large part in this. The war against Russia devoured most of the treasury. Gustav III introduced the Musical Academy in 1771 and had numerous concerts at Drottningholm, but the current cash shortage was large. The orchestra performing was the opera orchestra, which also was financed with the help of the king's own cash. At the opera there was no leaders, and this contributed to it was still in its infancy. The Kapellmeister, Abbé Vogler, was not there here on full-time basis, but divided his time between other tasks and Stockholm. This led naturally to development was necessary. Here we see a development that is needed and that will create a Swedish musical life and put a stamp on it in the future. This will happen over the next 40 years. Those who put their stamp on this was the many visiting virtuosos and composers. These had more or less a free role to create a musical life as we see remnant of today. It came to dominate the musical scene was the orchestra concert in auditoriums, orchestra concerts, opera concerts, and to name only a few. Although these had been under the King Gustav III, but it was at the beginning of the 19th century they began to take structural form. Music also was played in churches, where it often was consisting of choirs, soloists and orchestras. The venues were the Night House, called Riddarhuset, and Börssalen, situating in Old Town. Another contributing factor was that in 1809, Union dissolved and Finland becomes independent from Sweden. This means that there will be more money into the life of culture. It should also be mentioned that many was the Finland Swedes who went to Sweden to serve there. And such was our main character of this story, Bernhard Henric Crusell. Crusell in Stockholm. Crusell was employed in 1793, probably as a deputy in the orchestra, then obtain a permanent position in the following year in the opera orchestra. There are scanty notes from Crusell in his diaries about this services there. It is still to clarify what Crusell was working with, the orchestra, and he was operating as a clarinet player. He played only this instrument and not, as some sources indicate, oboe, bassoon, flute. This is probably to do with the various forms of employment. These were mostly designed to get more money. He also received the title acting court conductor. This was more a title exercise than conducting. After Dupuy came Berwald and not Crusell, as Dupuy had tried to convince the management. In 1798 to 99 to Germany and then to France in 1803-1804. In Berlin he received teaching of Franz Tausch. Unfortunately there are no notes what was done at the lessons and what the teaching contained with Tausch. This is regrettable, as it might have been able to see what his clarinet education had. Tausch belonged to one of the most recognized virtuosos and teachers of his instrument. He probably played an instrument consisting only of 5 keys and with an embouchure with a reed above, that is, Oberstisch. Something that occurs common at that time. Whether or not this embouchure was played by Crusell, we don't know. Maybe he changed to a more common that we know of embouchure, that is the reed down then. We only know that Crusell wrote in his diary, and he was very disappointed about starting the lessons with Tausch, only playing the basic exercise such as scales and arpeggios, etc. To finance the Berlin stay and the travel expenses, Crusell gave a concert which covered all the traveling money to get to Hamburg. It was very strong desire to become acquainted also with the brother Louis and Jean-Xavier Lefebvre, both principal clarinet players at the Paris Opera. They exchanged ideas and compositions and kept in touch through letters when Crusell returned to Stockholm. Probably Crusell only wanted a collegial cooperation with Lefebvre. The latter should be emphasized when Crusell also in his diaries referred to this and described how Lefebvre played and what his profile was. Among other things that Crusell said about Lefebvre was that he could play very easy in the high register and he had a good taste in terms of phrasing. It was Xavier's brother, Louis, also principal clarinet player, that Crusell socialized at the end of the Paris stay. Concerning the instruments, probably already Crusell had the key for C sharp and G sharp, which was one of the great importance for playing music of the 18th century. Perhaps Crusell's instrument from Grenzer already had it solved, or he knew about them. He was also given the Lefebvre method, and he played it straight through, and this wouldn't have actually been possible without the C sharp, D sharp key. Now the story that needs to be corrected. About 1803, a commitment at the Italian Opera in Paris was offered to Crusell. It also emerged through the diary's entries that Crusell requested 3 times more money than he was offered. He also tried to remain in Paris over the winter, but was called home by his king, Gustav IV Adolf. He wanted his clarinet player back in Stockholm. These two stories now have been mixed up with each other. So, the story of real truth is, and Crusell writes this in his diary in Finnish, and this is the only time he uses Finnish in his diaries. And it says that he turned the job down in Paris due to that the payment was too small, and he wanted 3 times more. He also met with Peters, who he had corresponded for many years with. Peters also in 1830 proposed to Crusell to write a method. It is a great pity that this method didn't realize. This could have been a basic resource for clarinet playing. Maybe Crusell hesitated being challenged when he knew he already belonged for a time that no longer existed. It may also be the fact that contributed to the reform of Müller and other clarinet virtuosos took place, but yet had such a method has been a unique source of material. What instrument did Crusell play before he used the Grenzer instruments? Well, he started out on a clarinet made of birch with 2 keys. He then got in touch with a more developed instrument in 1788. Maybe this instrument was made by Westerberg. In 1791 until 1803, his instrument must have been very well developed, because when he played the music by Grenzer and Michael Jost in 1797 and also in 1798, a concerto by Tausch, he needed a lot of keys for this. Most likely it was an important instrument, but it may also have been a Swedish instrument made by the Swedish builder Johan Karlström. And as I said before, Crusell was aware of the C sharp, G sharp key, as some of the compositions he played contained evidence for this. So he must have had or have access to an instrument with this key. Admittedly, Crusell in 1803 bought an instrument by Baumann at his Paris stay, and he also told Baumann that he had already his C-sharp, G-sharp key. In 1806, Crusell ordered an instrument by Grenzer through Tausch concerns. However, after 6 years, he hadn't received the instrument. In 1811, he had a long meeting and dinner with Grenzer, and they discussed instruments, reeds and mouthpieces. Crusell tried reeds and mouthpieces in July 1811 and said that the reeds that were oiled, that's moisture I think, were better than the dry ones. On reeds, Crusell touches this later regarding his conversation with Tausch, and also in the correspondence with Lefebvre. And the latter also thanks Crusell for this. He had, after 1811, contact with instrument luthier other than Grenzer, and that is Wiesner, the successor to Grenzer. Grenzer also let Wiesner marry his widow so they can continue the business. And this was also a common thing to do in that time. He also met to see Wiesner in 1822 and arranged to have a C clarinet, but also putting on some extra keys on the B flat. Crusell was also arranging clarinets from Wiesner to former students and colleagues. In 1826, he mentioned this in a letter to Hans Hjerte. The commission instrument is in Ebenholz and with silver keys, and a corde de change in A. This instrument was to be tested by Cotte, a clarinet player in the court theatre of Dresden. However, Crusell remained true to Wiesner instruments, but they discussed how much it could be developed keys and instrument. Crusell was also very interested in the Müller design and had some correspondence with a colleague called Charles Baudin in Paris about this. Crusell was also told to public comment on the design of the Müller system, but he didn't. At Crusell's death, he left 4 clarinets, 2 old instruments, one in Buxbaum and one in Ebenholz with silver keys. No one of these instruments are preserved. If this instrument were given away by Crusell, he probably didn't use it. It might be so, since the instrument also was shortened to higher pitch around 1835. This we know since the Grenzer bassoons are preserved, and it happened to those in several occasions. However, the instrument can be found in a deposit at the Music Museum Stockholm with a number 43554, and it also has a corde de change and a case made by Grenzer. Crusell also had contact with Simon Hermstedt. We can only guess that he's probably discussed instrument, reeds and even playing techniques. Hermstedt, as Louis Borges clarinet, was known to play very virtuosic technique and played up to C4. However, he was known for a personal sound, but he had a special design clarinet. This might have been on corresponding level, but there is also a letter that Hermstedt and Crusell met, but probably it was Hermstedt and a pupil to Crusell, namely Adner, who met in 1812, because Crusell didn't make a journey in 1812. And why was Crusell so cold-hearted about the Weber music? That was so extremely popular on the continent, probably only just because he felt that the music style didn't suit him and that he had already found his style. The diatonic scales of Weber and Crusell are very similar in influence. It's also worth mentioning that Crusell preferred chromatic ascending, while Weber downward. A very strong thing technically and musically. But Crusell owned all Weber's music and clarinet music, and he only performed the variation Opus 33. Concerning the compositions of Crusell, you can also see a further development in the sonata form. That is, Crusell built a very strong modulation which highlights the themes and the theme and details about it, around it. Otherwise, Crusell kept on tradition with a third movement as a minuet when they were chamber music and with the accompaniment trio. something he backed out of 2 compositions only. What is more interesting, however, he uses melodies that are taken the influence of French opera. And one of those composers were Etienne Méhul. And Méhul was played very often at the Swedish Opera at that time. Crusell worked there. He also uses the A-clarinet very sparingly. One in the quartet and also in the big aria of the Lilla Slavina, the opera buffa. But he was one of the first to play the Mozart Clarinet Concerto after Anton Stadler. But he used it normal A clarinet, not a bassett clarinet. He took also a lot of influence of the Mozart music. But in terms of structure, he was more closer to Haydn than Mozart. As regard to technical passage, we can also see a majority in the use of passages that lie well under the instrument. This doesn't mean, however, that it's easy to play, but Crusell knows exactly what he's looking for. Crusell emphasizes almost always the cantabile playing, but many of his compositions are very technically driven as well. It also can be observed in that compositions are very progressive in technique and musical basis. Subdominant chords becomes more and more formal expression. Ornamentation was similar to one of the following short drills and cadenzas, approach to an accumulation of driller than preceded. Crusell often uses the instrument in different rows, for example, so he uses the low register as an ostinato pattern. Something that should be noted that Crusell often uses kind of sound effects that isolates notes and passages. This became a huge demand on the performance. And such example can be found in the second movement of the concerto in F minor, opus 5. We must remember that Crusell was writing for himself to perform, and not as Weber and Spohr, which had a clarinetist in mind, that is, Bernhard and Harg. Crusell didn't want to make himself put in a bad musical environment. He, in the contrary of Spohr and Weber, emphasized the cantabile way of playing, and he knew the clarinet very well.